Howdy of you delicious people. I'm here today to review Coming to America. So, ultimately in this movie, I'm going to let you know, check this movie out on Amazon. It just dropped today on Amazon. Also, you can also go and see the original Coming to America. And reasonably, when looking at it, I'm going to purposely review both movies today. So if you guys like the original, you can check out the review of the original on another video today, or check out the sequel, this one, hopefully, or otherwise, what am I doing this for? But anyways, so getting all that stuff out of the way. So Amazon's in Amazon. Check it all on Amazon. Go on Amazon. Check it all out. Especially if you have an Amazon Prime account. So, or go into some bootleggish Movie Pro or some other app that you can probably watch this for free, but I watched it free on Amazon. So, ultimately, I really did enjoy this movie. Man, does it feel like not a lot of time has passed with this movie. Man, do they really reach back the nostalgia of the very first movie and ultimately have it to where you're just like, man, like, it looks like they tried as much as humanly possible to recreate a lot of atmospheres from the original movie. Like, to looking at it, I was like, oh my god, like, there is so many beats in here that I'm like, oh my god, this is just like the original. This is just like the original. They really pulled this off. Ultimately, when going into this movie, I would ultimately say forcibly, I like the writing of the original one because ultimately it's hard to beat the original one, writing wise. Ultimately, we do kind of like, even though I really thumbs up this movie, I ultimately would also say that there is kind of a Bill and Ted kind of face the music with this movie kind of approach too, as far as writing goes. Because ultimately we have to realize that it's like, well, Eddie Murphy is coming in to sell this movie, but also there is a younger generation of people that are otherwise going to have to be tied to this movie as well. So basically, it's kind of like, well, yeah, you're getting Eddie Murphy, but you're also having to really get the next people that are otherwise coming to America as well, kind of thing. So this does become like a generational movie where it's like, oh well, here's the next step of things. But man, I was really impressed. Like, if anything, there was a lot of moments in this movie where I was like, oh my god, they have this person in this movie? Oh my god, they have this person? There was so many times where I was just like, wow, like I was overwhelmed by really just the star-studded event that really is this film, because when looking at it, I'm like, they tie a ton of stuff from the first movie, but on top of that, they try to do like a movie that is in a very much bigger production value, I think, from the original. To ultimately have it to where, like, yeah, this movie definitely had money. If it actually didn't look that way, then yeah, like, I really enjoy this movie. With the exclusion of I just enjoy the first one better, just writing wise. It was just enjoyable. Because it was funny. It was fun. It was really just a different kind of approach. Like, that movie kind of really stuck out, and this movie kind of, like, it sticks out, like, because it feels very different than anything that I've seen in the last couple of decades. But it really just was like, yeah, but they're kind of handing off this story to another generation of people, and that's the only qualms that I had. I would have wanted to see Eddie Murphy more. I would have wanted to see uh, the original cast more, if you could do that. Because it's like, dude, you get every beat, every note, every what do you want? What do you want? What more do you want from this movie? Like, Like they kind of had to give you a like it's a sequel, so they kind of had to do a sequel a certain way. Uh, so ultimately, like there's nothing wrong with it. Thumbs up movie. Uh, it's really good. I really enjoyed it. It's just uh, like plus I think they pretty much got like the best actors and actresses they could find to ultimately kind of continue on this story. And that's what I could really applaud this movie for doing, of just like they picked the right people for the right roles. And there is no small part really in this movie, with the exclusion of just the next generation of actors that haven't done enough. But eventually, I hope to see them somewhere down the road in a lot more things. So, otherwise, I would say big plus film, big thumbs up. I enjoy this movie. So reasonably, people who are kind of on the fence about seeing this movie on Amazon or not, I would definitely say to check it out. I really enjoyed it. Um, Again, people might have qualms about the story or whatever, but you can't beat the original movie. You can't. I know a lot of people will ultimately say for every single sequel, it's like the sequel wasn't as good as the original. That's kind of just a standard of just the sequel is not as good as the original. But anyways, I'm gonna be reviewing the original, so we'll get that out and how much I thoroughly enjoyed that film. Watching it again after seeing it for so long, I ended up seeing it in I think on TV late at night at one of those points, and ultimately it was just like, man, this movie is so fun, so fun. So let's get into this one. Let's ultimately go into the otherwise double five timed count and ultimately go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this movie. So, one thing before everyone goes, I was really happy of the ultimate original cast coming into this movie for the most point. If anything, I liked what they did with James Earl Jones for this movie. I guess that can quite possibly be cryptic. I like what they did with that character. Um, Ultimately, it was kind of like it was a little odd, but then again, like I liked what they overall did. So let's go into spoilers now. Spoilers, everybody. Spoilers galore in this now for movie to America. So, man, do I really enjoy all of the music that they added in this movie. Just the music. Because ultimately, like every single song, it's a song that everybody like remembers, and like I remembered every bit of these songs. Like, yeah, yeah, like weird, bizarre. Like I'm at a death metal concert, but I'm listening to all this music. Man, was it so enjoyable to. There was some points where they were tying in music because of nostalgic purposes, and they were also tying in music just because of it was like, well, hey, like we're gonna bring back like music and kind of like twist it a little bit. Like ultimately having the Coming to America song in here, I was like, yeah, I was like, this is great. So going into this movie, we ultimately have it to where we are to have it to the fact that we have Prince Akeem, who's of course Eddie Murphy. We end up having it to where, like, funny enough, when watching the original one and watching this one, we end up having it to where like everyone is like following Prince Akeem around, like they're glued to his hip. Like in this movie, it doesn't feel like there is that. Like it kind of feels like there are some separation between people, and I could appreciate this movie for that. Because it seemed like, good God, it seemed for like Akeem in the first one was like, man, people were just like super glued to his super glued to his. Uh, where was I going with there? Super glued to his hip. What was I gonna say? Ugh. Um, I was almost gonna say the wrong word there. So we end up having it to where we find out that James Earl Jones we are to assess or assume is going to be bowing out of the king position. And so we end up having it to where James Earl Jones is on his bed, ultimately saying like, "Hey, like, I'm still kicking, I'm still here." I'm like, "Yeah, go Mufasa!" No, no, King Joffrey. I was like, "Yeah." I'm like, he's in this movie. Yes. I was so happy to ultimately have James Earl Jones in this movie. But we are having him in here in this movie just to send him off, which James Earl Jones. So we end up having it to where ultimately we have this big celebration that is to really just send off James Earl Jones's character as king. Because ultimately, at the very end of this ceremony, we have it to where James Earl Jones, like, kind of just ultimately is to basically say it's like, okay, well, I'm gone now. I'm done. Like I'm like we have it to ultimately James Earl Jones leaves this movie, and we have it to where in this celebration, good grief, or there's so many people. There's like Morgan Freeman announcing stuff. Legitimately, Morgan Freeman. I was like, we end up having it to where Salt and Pepper comes in and is like singing what a king, what a king, what a king, what a mighty good king. I'm like, yeah, Salt and Pepper is here. Like it seems like they like mix all kinds of like things together, ultimately giving people kind of reminiscent vibes in here. And ultimately they adjust and tweak songs to ultimately fit what is to go on. There's a lot of music going on in this movie. Sometimes it's a good thing, and sometimes it's just kind of like, okay, a little bit too much on the music, but I can be fine with it. Uh, there is kind of some moment where we have it to where it seems like the whole moment where we have uh, uh, Lavelle, I believe his name is, the 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 new quite possible heir to the throne in this movie. When we have it to where ultimately he is supposedly going to meet the woman that he is going to have to forcibly marry, that whole introduction scene of them doing this dance number and singing, like I thought that was a little bit goofy. I was just kind of like, okay, I was like, like, because we end up having it to where he ends up like joining in and like starts singing along in the song, and I was like, okay, this is a little much. I was like, what is this going to be like? Coming to America, the musical? But like that part aside, like that stuff, I was just kind of like, okay, they're kind of going into musical routes in here. Um, but it's always like an introductional thing, or it's like a celebrational thing, and I just don't know exactly like if that's all they do consistently or whatever. So but I think it's also to give us backstory on certain characters, because we ultimately find that the girl that ultimately Lavelle is going to end up with ultimately knows something about this guy's musical interest, and so that is to kind of snare him into uh, being wedded. But let's rear back a little bit. So ultimately back to where so James Earl Jones bowing out of the king position, and we ultimately have it to where we have of course now we have to our course now King Akeem. And so we have it to where seemingly there is a General Lizzie, or Izzy? General Izzy. I'll say it's Izzy. Who is ultimately played by Wesley Snipes. And I was like, Wesley Snipes is in this movie? Interesting. So we end up having it to where Wesley Snipes is playing the villain in this movie. I say villain because there isn't a garner of a real like this isn't really a true villainous story, but I guess there is quasi fight scenes into it, so I guess he's like a quasi villain. Like, there isn't a villain in the first movie, with the exclusion of maybe the guy that was in ER, which ultimately, when I'll get to that in the original movie. But anyways, so going into this, we ultimately find out. So General Izzy ultimately goes into just saying like, "Hey, like, you need to give us an heir so I can marry my daughter off." So we end up having it to where Eddie Murphy's or Akeem is having to scramble to find some heir, because ultimately all he has is three daughters, which I'm ultimately like, well, hey, why not one of them be the technical heir thing? Like, come on! Like, immediately that's what popped in my head. I was like, make one of the girls, the eldest girl. But ultimately they're like, well, no, you know what? We ultimately have it to where Prince Akeem had been getting busy with a woman out of wedlock when he was in America. We ultimately flash back to really going through old footage and having it to where ultimately uh, we have to where Semi and Prince Akeem are ultimately back in the original movie, where we're kind of using stock footage for some of the points, but then we're also recreating new footage that looks like Eddie Murphy as he was when he was in Coming to America. Like, the kind of the special effects that they try to do in this movie may not have seemed seamless, but I really don't care. Like, the special effects or the otherwise just making Eddie looking younger and whatever. Like, I think there was reasonably sometimes where I was like, meh, like, so what if it doesn't seem absolutely seamless with everything they do? I don't care. So we end up finding out that Prince Akeem ultimately had slept with ultimately Mary Johnson to ultimately give a bastard son to seemingly Prince Akeem, because we end up finding out that the prince had ultimately gotten busy with a woman while he was in America, and ultimately that had spawned a child. So we ultimately have it to where now they have to seek out this kid, and we end up finding out that this kid is ultimately trying to go and interview for jobs. We end up finding out that Tracy Morgan is his stepfather, and I'm like, oh yeah, Tracy Morgan. I'm like, yeah. Like, I think some of this is just kind of like, okay, well, let's kind of add in some Saturday Night Live characters. But when also looking into this, I was like, well, yeah, of course you'd have Tracy Morgan in this movie. Like, I was hoping that there'd be like uh, some kind of real Saturday Night Live like alums in this movie, anyways. And sure, far enough, we have Tracy Morgan in this movie. So when going into here, we ultimately have it to where uh, Lavelle is ultimately going in and trying to do this job interview, and he is ultimately doing. Uh, he's ultimately trying to do his best to win this guy over, and it doesn't work out. So we ultimately have it to where Lavelle is just a ticket scalper, and we end up finding out that seemingly Prince Akeem and Semi end up going their way to back into that barber shop, where ultimately we have the same old uh, three guys in this barber shop all talking about either boxing or whatever the heck else is going on in the news or whatever today. And so ultimately we have it to where Akeem and Simi ultimately ask like, hey, where can we go to find this boy? And sure, far enough, these people know exactly where to find him, and so we end up having it to where Prince Akeem ends up going, or King Akeem. I'm just gonna call him Akeem the rest of this review. Akeem ends up going and finding and seeing his son, but we end up having it to where ultimately we have to have Akeem switch his wardrobe to ultimately have it to where uh, to where Lavelle ultimately doesn't get weirded out. So we end up having it to where Eddie ends up changing in the exact same clothes as he did in the original Coming to America. When he comes into America and switches into seemingly a New York Mets jacket and all the bells and whistles that are on that jacket and like the exact same hat. So every bit of this outfit like might have been the actual outfit that somebody saved somewhere, or ultimately they had to completely recreate this entire outfit, or ultimately Eddie Murphy probably just had any number of any of these clothes probably just laying around or whatever. Who knows? Uh, or maybe this was probably sitting in some airlocked thing somewhere as a trophy case from some movie or whatever, and so ultimately they're like, we need that. So, but anyways, I just thought it was amazing. So we end up having it to where ultimately Eddie approaches Lavelle and ultimately says, "Hey, I'm your father. You're gonna be the new princess of Samunda." And so ultimately we have it where this guy's like, dude, is this guy crazy? But we eventually find out that seemingly that we end up having it to where Semi and Akeem end up going back to Mary's place, and Mary ends up going, "Oh yeah, that was my prince, my man that ultimately had given me a child." And so ultimately I'm like, wait a minute. So I guess Mary couldn't have figured out a way to contact. Well, I guess when looking at it, it's like, how would you have been able to like get a hold and whatever of it wouldn't have worked out. So we have it to where we have to basically fly uh, Mary and Lavelle all the way to Samunda, and so ultimately we have it to where Lavelle and Mary are just like, oh my god, we just hit the jackpot, because they had gone from like basically rags to riches, and so we ultimately end up finding out that we end up having it to where there's a like it's not like they can just give him the crown and here you go. We end up having it to where Lavelle has to basically learn their ways. Like it's kind of like it's kind of one of those kind of like Princess Diary like moments or whatever you want to call it, where ultimately you have it to where like, okay, this is a person that came off the street and now they have to be trained in the ways of the Samunda, if you want to say that. Like you have it to where like somebody came off the street and so ultimately they have to learn the ways of this kingdom and how to kind of look in a way of which to otherwise be presentable. Anyways, so we end up having this kid changing his hair to ultimately look, I think, more like Killmonger from Black Panther, like kind of the way his hair looks. So like man, that kind of looks like Killmonger from Black Panther. I was like, I don't know if they were going that way of choice for hair or whatever, but I think it just looked really cool. So we end up having it to where the kid has like a the hairline kind of like how Eddie Murphy had in the first movie, where it's like a little long strand of a thing at the end there. But I thought that was really interesting. So going on into here, so we end up having it to where this son is ultimately going to have to learn how to be a prince, and while that is going on, we have it to where the girl that is ultimately going to be for this prince ultimately shows up and plays a song that ultimately evidently Mary, who's ultimately Lavelle's mother, ultimately really liked. And so we end up having it to where they end up playing this song, and we end up having it to where all of a sudden, like bizarrely, uh, Lavelle jumps in and grabs a microphone and just kind of like chimes in. We ultimately have it to where the girl that is ultimately like gearing herself up for Lavelle is ultimately singing this song, and so ultimately I'm just like okay, so is this like Coming to America the musical? I'm like, okay, this is a little bizarre, but uh, like I don't know. I feel like they were just kind of like approaching this to eventually go into some musical approach. I don't know. Maybe they were before the whole new normal thing happened. Maybe that's what they were gonna try to do. Because this movie seemed much more musical than the original one did. But you can't knock the music in this movie. So going into here, so we end up having it to where seemingly that we have Lavelle going through his trials, and we ultimately end up having it to where like he's trying to learn every single king that had come before him, and we end up having it to where like Lavelle is just like at first he's like having issues trying to figure out who every single prince is and everything like that, and every single king would ever come before him, and so on and so forth. And so we end up having it to where while this is all going on, we end up having it uh, to where Akeem's oldest is just like, well, hey, like, dude, I've been working hard. Like, I've been here every day. We end up having it to where Akeem's oldest girl ultimately is going and like training harder and trying to impress her father, because ultimately it seems that like she's not a real big part of this story, and they kind of shoehorn her into the story a lot more, which I can really appreciate. But anyways, so we end up having it to have it to be that one of Lavelle's tasks is to ultimately get the whiskers of a lion. And so ultimately, I would assess that probably in previous times before, we would end up having James Earl Jones probably wrestle this lion to the ground and maybe kill it. Hence why he has that basically the lion skin onto his body and whatever, what have you. So going into this movie, so we end up having that be a trial, and we end up having it to where Lavelle is like, "Are you serious? Like, dude, I'm gonna die trying to get these hairs." And we end up having it to where it's like, "Oh well, like, dude, every king has had to do this, and so you are that. Like, tradition is tradition." So we end up having it to where reasonably that uh, Akeem's oldest daughter eventually is to help Lavelle try and do this trial. Because we ultimately have it to where Lavelle is ultimately just going like, well, maybe I don't need to like go and kill it. Maybe I can just outsmart it and just be able to accomplish this. And so ultimately we have it to where Akeem's daughter and Lavelle are working together, and so they concoct a plan to ultimately get bamboo sticks and kind of tie them all together. And so we end up having it to where ultimately Akeem is to run up on this lion, and so when this lion goes chasing after him, we end up having it to where he had planted a trap this whole entire time to end up having it to where there's seemingly a cage that he could just toss over himself, and so the lion is going at him just and so we end up having it to where reasonably that the lion is all of a sudden just starting to lick the bars. We end up finding out that they had coated the bars of this bamboo sticks with cat food, bizarrely. So we end up having it to where the lion is licking the bars, and while that's going on, we end up having it to where the Vel is ultimately going and scissoring away the whiskers to ultimately showcase like, hey everybody, I have the whiskers, and so ultimately they're like, yeah, he has them. So we end up having it to a reasonably that we push on and ultimately just are like, yeah, like he's gonna get his woman, and like he's gonna be prince, everything's gonna work out. And we eventually have it to where ultimately we have Lavelle eventually talking to his barber lady, his like I don't want to say like I would maybe say he's a quasi assistant Ash like character. So we end up finding out that seemingly that when Lavelle is talking to this girl, it seems uh, like they can really talk to one another. They can really go and like they have like-minded interests or common interests. So it really is to the point of like Vel going like, man, like I would really like to have that girl be my to be my queen, to be my woman, to be my whatever. And so we end up having it to where they end up kissing and then they regret it. And so we end up having it to where ultimately Lavelle is ultimately going to tell like the king, it's like, hey man, I already found my woman kind of thing. And we ultimately seemingly have it to where Lavelle is ultimately forced into this whole situation not out of love from Eddie Murphy. It's just kind of a means to an ends kind of thing, where we end up finding out that Lavelle was just a pawn in this whole thing to orchestrate that both of these people could make a profit off of this wedding. We end up having it to where LeVar is meeting his wife to be, and we have it to where again this girl is parroting every single thing that this guy's saying. Ultimately, saying like, "Hey, what music do you like? Any music that you like? What kind of food do you like to eat? Any food you like to eat?" So it's like there's a lot of times in here where I feel like this is like beat for beat like the original, and ultimately we have it to where there's like so I'm like, dude, decades later, like we still don't have like certain women that are going to have their own thoughts and feelings, like especially for this girl. Which I'm ultimately just like, like you would have thought that it would have kind of flipped the other way, where she's just like, well, you're gonna like everything that I like, and like, so that's where this guy would have been just like, well, how about we just like the same things together, like, because ultimately they could have said like this is an arranged marriage, so like I just didn't like how the fact that she still had to like go out of her way to please this man where ultimately it didn't really matter, where it could have just been like, man, I'm not gonna like I'm gonna be my own woman. So we end up having it to where Lavelle and his barber ultimately I don't want to take the time to scroll through and find every one of these characters. I just don't. We end up having it to where they go off on their own to go back to America because they're like, dude, like Eddie Murphy's or Akeem doesn't really love me. It's ultimately just a plot device. So we're bouncing. We're gonna get out of here. We ultimately have it to where within this movie we end up having it to where Lisa is also giving Eddie crap. Like we have it to where Lisa and Mary are like drinking it out and just like singing all these songs and it's really fun. But then eventually we have it to where Lisa like lits into freaking Eddie, Akeem, basically about like hey, like you realize how hard your daughter is working for you, and like you're not even paying attention to her. Like I thought you were to become king to make changes around here, and you're not doing anything. So we end up having it to where ultimately Lisa ends up throwing Eddie Murphy's character out because it's like, dude, you're not making your family happy. If anything, you're just kind of just tearing everyone apart. Is really what you're doing. So you got to step in and do something. So we end up having it to where Eddie goes out of his way to go and find his son. And we end up finding out that his son is getting married at just any chapel that is open. And Eddie ends up going and saying, like, oh, okay, well, if you guys are going to get married, I'm going to be here to be by your side. And ultimately, we have it to where seemingly once the wedding actually gets going, because we have Arsenio Hall being of course, the preacher, because we have so many people that ultimately are played by different, either Eddie or Arsenio Hall. You can kind of see where ultimately they kind of cut it to make it look like they're in the same area together, but when looking at it, it's not like they're going to do any extra things like they did in the like. They're not going to do any extra things now because it's special effects and whatever that they can do. No, they're going to approach this just like the original movie for the most point. So going into this, so we have it to where the Barbara girl ultimately is to decide, you know what? I don't think that we should get married. Like, I think that we should have this be a real legitimate wedding and have it be a big production with my family and your family and everybody and whatever. Like, this should be a big thing. And so ultimately, they end up halting on the wedding and they end up going back to Samunda. So ultimately, we have it to where while Akeem is away and his eldest daughter is having to take charge, we end up finding that General Izzy is getting a little bit of ants in his pants, so to speak, and he's kind of becoming really impatient about like, hey, where is this kid? I want her to marry my daughter. Like, what is going on? And we end up having it to where we ending up having the general just kind of like ultimately just taking is gonna try and take the general's or gonna take Akeem's daughter as like a hostage until they figure things out, like as collateral. And we end up having it to where Akeem's daughter ends up decking all of these guards, and we end up having it to where Salim comes in with a bunch of other girls and starts doing these like stick fights, and I'm just like, yeah, like Arsenio Hall, go, yeah. But we end up having it to where like the real true thing here is to have Akeem's eldest daughter to be um, looking great in here, and of course she does. So we end up having it to where ultimately they take down Wesley Snipes and ultimately just say like, yeah, like you're not going to do what you want. And we have it to where eventually when Eddie Murphy and Lavelle ultimately come back, we end up finding out that ultimately Akeem's going to make changes. Ultimately, he goes to his eldest daughter and he's like, you know what? I'm going to make you my heir. I'm going to change things. And ultimately, we're going to have Lavelle as an American ambassador. And so ultimately, you're going to be my heir because when looking at it, while I was gone, you were taking care of business. You were taking care of business. So you're gonna be my heir. And we ultimately see how like great that is and how like that is a great approach. So we end up having it to where like basically at the end of this everybody's happy, everyone's having yet another party celebration for wedding and so on and what have you, and we end up having it to where there is a yet another get together where they end up having it to where uh, there is supposedly going to be a big huge name that is going to perform at the end of this movie, and we end up having it to where the big performer is Eddie Murphy singing away with his sexual chocolate band and playing this song out again. And we ultimately have to where the girls who ultimately were rapping in the first movie, because they showed that sequence in here, they end up coming back and they end up performing. And I was like, oh wow, that's really cool. Like, bring them back. That's great. Like, there's so much nostalgia in this movie. We ultimately have it where the girl who ended up barking and sounding like a otter or whatever, um, like she ended up barking and some other thing. She ends up coming back to ultimately be Wesley Snipes' sister. We're ultimately have to where Wesley Snipes is just kind of happy at the end of this. Wesley Snipes' character, the general, he's just kind of happy because he's like, you know what, like at least you made my sister stop barking, so I can just be happy with that at least. And we end up having it to where still this marriage is still going to benefit these people, but in a different way. This new marriage between ultimately uh, Lavelle and his girlfriend or his whatever his wife or whatever this ends up being, because marriage or whatever, I don't know. But anyways, so we end up having it to where this big hoopla. Eddie Murphy comes in and sings, because ultimately we have it to where like, man, that guy's good. It's like, no, he's not. So while that is going on, we ultimately have this sent off with basically the entire cast of this movie ultimately doing a shot together, and that is to really just end this film. And so, really, I enjoyed it. I thought it was a fun movie. When looking at it, story aside, I like the fact that they did this movie. There was some interesting things about this film, and otherwise, justifiably, I just overall just I enjoyed it. It was fun. It was a fun thromp. I like the first one better story wise, but otherwise, other than that, like good film. I enjoyed it. So I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, buddy. Bye, buddy.